All right, well, we're on the home stretch, and it's a great pleasure and honor to introduce John Head, a good friend and colleague from Kansas, a law professor at the University of Kansas. This is going to be a different talk than we've been hearing earlier today. It definitely follows the quote, the Wesism, if your life's work can be accomplished in your lifetime, then you're not thinking big enough. Most of us, that comes into play with trying to perennialize the landscape with diverse crops that they're highly functional. That's probably not going to happen as much in my lifetime as I would like. But John delves into this in the socio-political realm, and it's fascinating where he goes. He goes places where I've never known anyone to go before. He looks like. Well, he does not look like he thinks. I mean, I think if he looked like he thinks walking down the street, if anyone remembers Ziggy Stardust or Bowie's Aladdin Sane, that is actually what John would look like if he was revealing his inner self. But I'll let him reveal his inner self with his words. And it's a pleasure, John Head.
Is this working now? Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back of the room? Okay. Am I shouting in the front of the room? Okay. Well, this is a tough thing to do because I see now that I'm standing between everyone and the wine shop. So it's not an enviable position to be in. As Tim was introducing me, and I thank you for that introduction, Tim. As he was introducing me, I was reminded of some television shows in the 1960s and 70s when the host would sometimes say, "And now for something entirely different." Well, I'd like to think that what I'm about to say is not entirely different enough that you'll think it doesn't fit in to the overall trajectory of what we've been discussing over the course of today and some yesterday as well. And I was thinking about how what I'm about to say, or at least the overall context, fits in with the context of our earlier discussions and presentations. Early on today, Leonard mentioned the notion of path dependence, or path dependency, and he pointed out that the decision to establish annual monoculture agriculture made about 10,000 years ago was an incident of path dependency, because so much that has followed has been governed by that decision, quote-unquote decision. Well, I'm going to make the point that the decision, quote-unquote decision, to establish the Westphalian nation-state system about 400 years ago is also an instance of path dependency. And so we need to get off the path there, just as we need to get off the path of annual monoculture agriculture. Wes Jackson this morning mentioned about a refrain that appears a lot, of course, in his work about using nature's ecosystems to design new structures. And of course, to a large extent, Wes is talking about new structures in agriculture. Well, I would like to use nature's ecosystems to design new structures, but in this case, in my case, in the area of governance, especially what I'll refer to as agroecological governance, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a few moments. Wes mentioned this morning the four spheres, the lithosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and all of those leading to and contributing to the biosphere. And in fact, Jan Kloff earlier today, I think, mentioned about the report that was announced, at least by UNESCO just yesterday, about threats to the biosphere. My areas of specific interest are in the lithosphere and the atmosphere in terms of the soil crisis and the climate crisis that we face as a species. And those are the two spheres that I'm most intensely interested in the proposals and the analysis that I'm going to try to summarize in just a few moments. And then lastly, well, I'll skip the lastly for now. I'll come back to the lastly later on. As you may see from the program, see if I can, okay. The title of my talk is quite long, and it builds, of course, on the theme of the overall conference. The theme of the overall conference is the future of agriculture perennial? And my topic for this afternoon is the future of agroecological governance also perennial? And then, of course, it has to have a subtitle. So the subtitle, it tells most of the story in a very few words: Proposals for Legal and Institutional Reforms at the Global Level to Support Perennial Agriculture and Environmental Protection. So here's the overall question that our conference is delving into. My question is closely related to it. You'll want to know what I mean by agroecological governance, or at least I hope you'll want to know what I mean by agroecological governance. I see it as being at the intersection of three main areas that I'm specifically interested in. One is agricultural reform, and in that respect, of course, I'm specifically interested, as this conference is, in perennial agriculture, and more specifically yet, in perennial polyculture agriculture. A second area that is of specific interest, special interest to me, is international law and institutions. I have practiced international law and taught, been an academic in international law now for a long time, so that's an area of my interest as well. And the term global governance is often used, sometimes to the alarm, perhaps, of Americans in particular. It does not mean, in my lexicon at least, global government, but at least it means the relationships and the mechanisms, the systems and networks by which we manage ourselves in our international relations. And then a third area is in environmental protection, and specifically the soil crisis and the climate crisis that I mentioned just a moment ago. So the area of my research right now, at least, falls right in the middle of these three areas. So this is it. My research really circulates around improving global agroecological governance. This is the slide that has most words on it, I think, and I hope, but it capsulates what I'm talking about, what I'm working on in my research. My aim is to design new legal and institutional structures that could facilitate a transformation from what I refer to as modern extractive agriculture to what I call agroecological husbandry, with a special emphasis on reconceptualizing state sovereignty and introducing new legal entities. And I'll talk more about those in just a moment. So the centerpiece of it all is, of course, agriculture, and the natural systems agriculture that all of us are somewhat aware of, some more than others, is what I'm interested in when I talk about agroecological husbandry. This is the cover of a book that I published a couple of years ago now, and it includes in the title the notion of agroecological husbandry, which is, as I define it in that book, natural systems agriculture focusing on perennial polycultures and restoring rural communities. I grew up on a farm. I'll show you a picture later on. I grew up on a farm in northeast Missouri in the central part of the United States, probably about 400 kilometers from Salina, where the Land Institute is located. So the natural systems agriculture, picking up, of course, on the point that Wes Jackson was making this morning, is mimicking natural ecosystems. And the perennial polycultures, of course, is as distinct from annual grains grown in monocultures. So these are the 6 main points that I want to touch on. Some of them are going to be familiar territory to you, so I'm going to touch on them only briefly. But first, agriculture dominates certain ecosystems worldwide, and certain categories of ecosystems worldwide. Secondly, it brings ecological degradation to most of those, most of the time. Third, it can be changed and improved, and indeed that's why we're here, isn't it? To talk about ways in which agriculture can be changed and improved. This then gets into the international law and agroecological governance side of it. Existing international governance structures do not work, or they will not work, to make that change, to facilitate that transformation. So I say let's design new structures, starting with the concept of state sovereignty, and create something that I'll explain in a few minutes as being eco-states or ecological states. And also design new structures at the global level to coordinate the work of those eco-states, what I call a global trust entity. So let's talk about the first two briefly. What do I mean by agriculture? What kind of agriculture? I'm talking about grains and legumes, cereals, food crops. Mainly because that's what we eat, that's what we grow. There's a lot of information, of course, available about the concentration of crops and diets. So annual grains occupy 70% of the croplands on Earth. 90% of the world's food comes from just 30 crop species, even though 7,000 or so exist. The world has over 50,000 edible plants, but just 3 of them, rice, maize, and wheat, provide 60% of the world's energy intake. 2/3 of the modern human caloric intake comes from grains and legumes. Wheat's the most widely grown cereal grain. So all of these figures give the emphasis to the concentration that agriculture now has. Where does this agriculture take place, and what ecosystems has the agriculture replaced or displaced or modified? First, the places in the world where the agriculture takes place is, of course, based partly on the beginnings of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent and elsewhere in the world. The areas marked in red here show centers of the origin of food production at various times around the world. Now let's take a look at where it is that the main food crops are grown, cereals and legumes and so forth in the world. This is maize. This is worldwide maize production, corn production, as of a few years ago. And the darker green obviously signifies the more intense production of maize. This is wheat, same sort of a picture, but this is wheat. So back to maize and now wheat. Soybeans is a different presentation, but the basic idea is that the more color that shows up, by and large, these are the areas that are most dominated by soybean production, and then this is rice. So the first 3 are different from the fourth. That is, rice is obviously in different ecosystems to a certain extent, except over in China, perhaps. So that's where the agriculture takes place. What ecosystems has this agriculture displaced or replaced? Well, for this, we have to think about first what an ecosystem is, or at least I have to figure out what an ecosystem is. For that purpose, I've relied a large part on the World Wildlife Fund classification system. Now, many of you are going to be familiar with that. You might be familiar with other systems that you would prefer to the World Wildlife Fund system. But I find it, at least as a sort of an opener, a useful system to use. It focuses on these various elements here: the climate, temperature, rainfall, and so forth, soils, land cover, and biodiversity. And from this set of data, then the World Wildlife Fund, or a very large group of scientists who have been associated with and supported by the World Wildlife Fund, have designated what they refer to as biomes and ecoregions. So this is a world map showing the various, all of the terrestrial ecoregions in the world. The very faint lines, you can see some over here in Australia, for example, distinguish the various ecoregions, and the different coloration reflects the various biomes, again under the World Wildlife Fund system of classification. We're today in the Baltic Mixed Forests ecoregion, numbered as ecoregion N. Oh no, that's not NA0405. I'll have to think what it's not an A. I have that. That's wrong. PA is PA0405, my mistake on that. This is a picture of all of the region here, and you can see that the biome that we are in, according to the World Wildlife Fund system of classification, is the temperate, broadleaf, and mixed forests biome. Let's close in again on Lund, and we'll see that the specific ecoregion, again, is PA, not NA, sorry, 0405, the Baltic Mixed Forests ecoregion. And it encompasses these various areas that are shown, that are shown in the red coloring here. But it's part of the overall, this is the same map but different coloration. It's within the same overall biome, which is the temperate broadleaf and mixed forests biome. This is another presentation. This is actually closer to the source of the World Wildlife Fund map system, and it shows the various ecoregions that fit within this biome, the temperate, broadleaf, and mixed forests biome. Back to the same map, and the various ecoregions, as I say, are distinguished by the faint lines, and nation-state borders are distinguished by the bold lines. This is another presentation of the same thing. Take a note of this slide, because I'll come back to this with a slightly different legend after a bit. Okay, so that's where the agriculture takes place. What ecosystems has it replaced? Those ecosystems that are partly in the mixed forest biome, temperate mixed forest, but also this one, the temperate grasslands, savanna, and shrublands biome. A different biome, a different set of ecoregions in the World Wildlife Fund system of classification. And as you can see, the main areas where that occurs, various places around the world. North America has about 30% of that biome in the Great Plains, the Central American grasslands. This is, again, the temperate broadleaf and mixed forest biome, and you can see that it occurs in these, mainly in these 5 areas. I'll also mention another one, the Mediterranean forests, woodlands, and scrub biome, because it also accommodates a lot of modern extractive agriculture, as I call it, and it exists in these various 6 places, not just around the Mediterranean basin, but also in these 5 other places, 2 in Australia over here, 1 in just the tip of South Africa, in Chile, and then, of course, in the Napa area and stretching down into Baja California. So this is then back to the maize production. You can see the overlap of these biomes, and then the wheat production. So agriculture, a conclusion so far, is that agriculture has largely displaced or replaced or degraded these various biomes, the temperate grasslands biome, the temperate broadleaf forest biome, and the Mediterranean biome. I've not yet touched on, and I won't go into the Mediterranean biome any further than I have so far. I also won't go into rice, which fits into a certain different biome as well. So for some comic relief, a little personal side trip, I mentioned I would show you a little bit about where I come from. Several of the speakers today have had maps that showed sort of where they're from. I come from the North American grasslands. I come from there in a couple of different ways. I grew up in this one here. This is region 0804, and I now live not too far away, only about 350 kilometers to the west, in the same ecoregion in Lawrence, Kansas. Here's a picture of me on my tractor on the farm where I grew up in northeast Missouri. The tractor is just 1 year younger than I am. And here's a picture of me a couple of years ago in the field across the road from where we live in Lawrence, or just outside Lawrence, Kansas, in some reclaimed prairie area that we've worked on. So these are my 6 points. I've covered the first 2 in terms of the ecological degradation of these various biomes. One question then is why do we care about the degradation to the grasslands? I've told you already where they are, mainly the temperate grasslands. Some of you from Africa are from the tropical grasslands biome as well. In North America, which holds about 30% of the area that used to be covered at least by the temperate grasslands biome, much of the area has been converted, of course, to agriculture. Just in case you're wondering, this little piece here is tropical grasslands biome. So what's the condition of these? In short, they have been heavily degraded in the North American circumstance, at least. 40% of the North American continent at one time was covered by native grasslands, and virtually all of these have been transformed into agricultural lands, and in a few other places in urban settings. East of the Missouri River, that's where I grew up in northeast Missouri, 98% of the tallgrass prairie is gone. The same situation occurs in Canada. I won't stop for the slide very much. And the reason for this is largely all of these, but especially inappropriate grazing and extractive agriculture. So the conclusion so far then is agriculture has destroyed or degraded the world's grassland ecosystems, and the same thing can be largely said of systems within other biomes, especially the temperate broadleaf and mixed forest biome where we are in southern Sweden now. Why should we care about this? Several people already have talked about the ecosystem services that are provided in the case of grasslands or former grasslands. These are some of them: soil conservation, carbon sequestration. I think you're familiar with those well enough. So the actions we've taken have squandered these benefits of the native grasslands that have been converted to agriculture. And the same thing can be said of the temperate broadleaf forest biome by the industrial or extractive agriculture that now dominates worldwide food production. Now we get into the part of this symposium, this conference, which is how it is that agriculture can be changed and improved. And again, that's where I concentrate my efforts on the emergence of perennial grains in polycultures, or natural systems agriculture. I wrote another book about 2 years ago that came out focusing some on the science of agricultural reform and especially on the law of agricultural reform. And you already know about the science, so I'll skip over the benefits of perennial grains in polyculture. I will point out, though, that I'm aware of certain counter-arguments and alternative viewpoints on the science. I'll just highlight two of them. Should we be as reliant as we are on grains in the human diet? It's unclear to me whether that's a good idea or not. Another thing is, what about population? Wes Jackson just touched ever so obliquely on it this morning in terms of overall human population. Should we be aiming to feed the 10 billion, or should we have a different approach to that? But let me turn now to the law of agricultural reform. Picking up on some work that Wes Jackson and Wendell Berry put into a New York Times column about, I guess, 8 or 10 years ago now, I've been trying to tease out the details of a 50-year farm bill as opposed to a 5-year farm bill in the context of the United States. But the same thing could be extrapolated to other systems as well. These are some of the contents that I think a 50-year farm bill should include: reorienting agricultural subsidies, doing away with fossil carbon subsidies, expanding scientific research into perennial polycultures, adopting the precautionary principle, and so forth. This is a chart that shows what I think of as the progression of the development of perennial grains. You can see that in 20 years from now, or from last year, we would have a little sliver of the U.S. production in perennials, and that it increases gradually over time, so that the annual grains, which is the larger part here in the early years, finally diminishes down to a smaller amount. So again, picking up on the work that Wes Jackson and people at the Land Institute more generally have done. On the global level, though, as well, it seems to me that there has to be significant reform. And for this, I'm proposing the preparation and the adoption of a treaty, what I call a Global Convention on Agroecology, which would have these various components to it. Principles and undertakings that would call for the reintegration of humans into the natural world, human responsibility for ecological integrity, and various other things, including a restructuring of global governance. So we now come to the point that I wish to emphasize why it is that the existing international governance structures won't work to make the change that I think all of us are interested in, at least transforming agriculture. And why it is, how it is that I'm suggesting we design new structures that would help in that direction. So a current book project which I have going on, which is going to be coming out I think in about 2 months, it's in page-proof stage now, is titled A Global Corporate Trust for Agroecological Integrity. And it has these 2 main parts to it. But the first part I want to touch on briefly: reorienting sovereignty, moving from the nation state to the eco-state, or the ecological state. I've done a lot of study into sovereignty. I knew a lot about sovereignty already from my international law studies, but I got hooked up with a bunch of political science people who really helped me dive into the notion of state sovereignty, statehood, and the concept of sovereignty. And I used a bunch of sources for this. the punchline is that it's a mess. The notion of sovereignty is a mess. And fortunately for us, there has actually been a departure in many ways that most people, or at least most Americans, I think, are unaware of, given the rhetoric of the day that we hear in the United States at least. There have been efforts to chip away at, to revise, to modernize what I refer to as traditional monolithic state sovereignty in ways that I think hold some promise. And I refer to it as layering of sovereignty and a blending of sovereignty. So here are some examples of layered sovereignty. In Italy, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, there are lots of circumstances in which special regimes are made up to have special authority or autonomy or kind of sovereignty for certain regions within these states. And of course, any country that has a federal system, such as the US and Canada and Australia and so forth, have a certain amount of layered sovereignty. And the sort of state-federal question in US law is a familiar territory to a lot of lawyers. In addition to that, there are some cases of blended sovereignty in which, within a particular territory, two entities, legal entities, will have some competing authority, or maybe, we'd hope, cooperating authority. So here's the International Joint Commission for the boundary waters between the United States and Canada, just as one illustration. There are several other illustrations that I try to tease out in the book that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, various transboundary protected areas, the UNESCO World Network of Biosphere Reserves. So why is any of this of interest? So what that there are these precedents? Well, I think that we can build on these precedents, and I'm trying to write in this direction, to build on these precedents so that we do have foundations to create some different type of a legal entity that's much stronger, much more robust than those that we've seen already in a few precedents around the world. I suggested that you keep this picture in mind because this is the World Wildlife Fund system of biomes around the world. It's the same slide, but now I've actually changed biome to ecostate. So the big idea here is that every biome, whether we use the World Wildlife Fund classification system or another classification system, is transformed into or used as the foundation for an ecostate. The idea then would be to distinguish between intraspecies rules and intraspecies rules. And for the first of those, the intraspecies, that is, those rules and those affairs, those issues that mainly affect human-to-human interactions and relationships. In those cases, those issues would be left to the nation states, or what I call the anthro-states. And the interspecies affairs, that is, when humans interact with other species, which is a lot of the time, and especially in the areas that we're talking about, of course, in this conference, then these newly constituted eco-states would have authority. So the idea would be to lead the effort to transform grain agriculture, especially in those eco-states that are now dominated by grain agriculture today. So these eco-states would have these various attributes. They would have territorial authority. They would be determined on ecological basis, on the basis of biomes, whether they're the World Wildlife Fund system or some other system of territorial compartmentalization based on ecological grounds. They would therefore, hence they would be perennial in nature. They wouldn't be subject to wars and political vagaries. They would be non-contiguous in their character, in their territorial layout, and just think back to this, where you have the temperate grasslands biome and therefore eco-state scattered around the world. I realize that this is a challenge. Maybe it's an opportunity as well. These eco-states would have the ability to issue and to adjudicate and to enforce binding rules because they would have legal personality in international law, the same as nation states that we're familiar with today have. They would have a blended administration, and here's where you bring in the polyculture side of it, in my analogy. They would have a blended administration of state and non-state actor representatives, and I can go into some detail on that if somebody is interested in details. And then they would have as their key goals to restore ecological integrity and to improve agricultural production. But this would be the trump card. Oh, I hate that word. This would be this would be the ace in the hole, I guess. It would prevail. The restoring ecological integrity would prevail over agricultural production. So here again is the array of eco-states in my proposal. Beyond this, Beyond this, though, beyond my eco-states proposal, I think there has to be something else that will help facilitate, through governmental change, through institutional change, facilitate a transformation of agriculture. And that's where I get to the second part of this current book project that's going to come out, I hope, in a few weeks, designing a global institution to support these eco-states and to bind nation-states and other actors to certain principles. How would we do that? How would we design a new international institution, a new global institution? Well, first we'd start by examining the ones we have already, identifying the strengths and, overpoweringly, the weaknesses of current international organizations. And maybe we would start with the most powerful ones, which in my book are the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the United Nations, and so forth. I've done a lot of work over the years in financial institutions, focusing on the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses of international financial institutions. And these are some of the main criticisms that I've tried to examine, separating the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. A couple of books I wrote several years ago. The writing is not as blurry as the images, I hope. So consider also various international institutions that currently do focus on agriculture in some ways, agriculture and to a certain extent on ecology or environmental protection. Among them, these institutions, unfortunately, from my view at least, most of these institutions, global institutions focusing on agriculture, have as their principal area of concentration increasing yields and incomes. Now, I'm not against increasing yields and incomes, but it doesn't seem that these institutions are the right ones as currently constituted to facilitate a transformation of agriculture into something that I think we're interested in. So I'm designing a new institution called what I call now a Global Corporate Trust for Agroecological Integrity. And it would have these various attributes that I've spelled out in some detail in this book. The reason I use these terms, by the way, is it would be global in the sense that nearly all nation states, but also non-state members would be included, including the eco-states, in the institution itself. Why the word corporate? Well, because it would have legal personality, not because there would be a heavy dose of corporation influence in the organization at all, but because it would have international legal personality. And why the word trust? Well, building on the notion of the public trust doctrine that is sort of dormant in the United States at least, and something like it exists in quite a few other legal systems around the world as well. There's a book recently written by a woman in Oregon, Mary Christina Wood, who says, let's dust off the old public trust doctrine and give new life to it and rely on courts through litigation to force government agents to serve the interests of the trust's beneficiaries. Now, the trust's beneficiaries, that is nature's trust's beneficiaries, under her formulation, would be future generations and present generation of humans mainly. I would go way beyond that. It seems to me that we should go global, not just in the U.S., based on the public trust doctrine, and that we should focus on legislative approaches as opposed to try to do litigation. I don't think that leaving it to the lawyers is going to do much good in the long term. Instead, I think we should have some form of a global plebiscite, a global constitutional convention that would adopt this new institution. And also, it would be interspecies in character. It would be protecting not just the future of humans, but also the future of non-humans. Okay, I'm just about to wrap up. These are the points that I've tried to cover. I think that the answer to the question that our conference asks, is the future of agriculture perennial, has to be yes. I kind of assume that most people who come think that it has to be yes. Yes, I say any viable future for agriculture must be perennial. Well, I answer my own related question similarly. My question is the future of agroecological governance also perennial? And my answer is yes. Any viable future for agroecological governance must be perennial in ways that I've tried to explain. Natural systems, perennial polycultures. And I'm using an analogy to the work of the Land Institute and others who have been involved in this grand project, this grand campaign, to try to bring reform to international law and governance. Lastly, I'll point out why I think that it might not work, why my project, why my efforts, why the proposals that I'm offering may not work. And the top one, obviously, is not just President Trump, but the rise of nationalism and nativism that we see around the world. This is, I think, a terrifying development, and it's one that has made me, in my years of being involved in international affairs, more dispirited than anything I've ever encountered. Also, property rights are so entrenched that the idea of a public trust itself might be difficult, will be difficult, I should say, to get popular support for. It might even be that democracy itself is unsuited, that democracy itself rejects the very types of long-term, post-carbon, eco-centered, low-consumption, high-sacrifice, law-based plans that I'm talking about. Because all of those elements, it seems to me, are involved in the proposals that I'm trying to come up with. And then even human nature itself. I think Wes Jackson touched a bit on this morning as well. Is self-regulation in our genes? And as a practical matter, a lot of people would take this position that treaties and international institutions cannot work. They're just too much of a failure already. We cannot expect these approaches to work. And it may simply be just too late. I hope it's not. I'm writing and reading and talking and discussing these issues with people on the assumption that it is not too late. At any rate, that's my presentation. Thanks. I think there is time for some questions and discussion if anybody would want to, and I'd certainly welcome any input that someone would like to offer. Oh, Bob has it. Yeah. I didn't turn it off. Okay. You may be excused to go to the liquor store, too.
Thank you so much for that. I did spend the weekend reading your book as part of it. And I've been working along the same line, thinking along the same line as much as I can. And I would just say one thing that I think might be more hopeful is that it's obvious to me as a sociologist that human nature has changed. And so it will change again. And I could go into that and give some examples maybe, but I don't think that's a limitation, and I think it's an ideology that it's fixed. The question I would have is, when the Westphalian system emerged, it was creating a new thing, nation states, out of a world that was not.
Right.
Right. So the church and
Feudalism,
Christendom, right. And of course, it was only part of the world, and then it expanded. I think we agree about how. My question, though, would be if something new is to emerge, and I do think a post-Westphalian world is necessary because the only way we know how to solve things now is to have wars, whether they're secession or boundaries or whatever. But there has to be something new. And so the question is, who would be the agents to create this global convention? How can nation states negotiate and remain the agents for intrahuman actions or relations, while intraspecies relations, which are more foundational,
Right.
Are governed by something else that's negotiated by somebody?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question, and it's one that I struggle with as well. Getting from here to there, especially through and then over or through nation states themselves, it's a tough nut to crack. But it does seem to me that if there are pressure points brought to bear, or pushed, you push a pressure point, I guess, among leaders of certain countries that have overwhelming power and leaders in existing international organizations who can be influenced, and philanthropic organizations who are increasingly intent on making change, and grassroots organizations, NGOs, civil society organizations, then this conglomeration, I'm hoping, of pressure can be effective. I'm reminded in this respect also of a book of, I think it came out about 5 years ago, The Quartet, in which 4 American leaders in the post-revolutionary period, Washington, Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, I think, in a sense, according to the author, conspired to push into existence, to send off, sailing into existence, this new constitutional structure in 1787, even though they represented the aristocracy, which was itself fading in importance. But they sort of sent off this new ship, this new entity. In some way, maybe the existing nation states and leaders of the world can do something similar to that. But it's a hard, hard question. I recognize that.
Thank you very much for the inspiring reflection. I just want to share some thoughts. I mean, I think it's great to start thinking about something else, because we definitely need something else. One thing that I would question is whether those eco states could be contiguous, and so you could have each region of the eco state in each continent or whatever be an eco state. That might be a way of making it easier than trying to have like that's one thing. The other thing that I was thinking is the fact that everything that gets too big, it's bad, right? I have the sense that to me there should be some kind of maximum amount of people in whatever structure. Or amount of wealth in whatever structure, because otherwise it gets to what we have, and so whether setting some sort of boundaries in that regard is important. And related to that is, well, the different eco states, because they are different eco states, are intrinsically different. Wealth, right? I mean, there are going to be some that are going to have the best soils and some that are going to be like deserts. So how do you create a new order when you're starting from such a different set of resources, when I would think that you would try to be more fair or whatever?
Even things out. Right.
Anyway, just to say, I think it's great that we start thinking about all this.
Well, yeah, a couple of responses. It seems like to me that the two parts to your question actually are pretty closely linked. There's a lot of literature, I guess it's research, as to the upper limit of the number of humans who can be in a group and have the group work effectively. And obviously these are, and nation states already, are huge population groups. The idea that I have is that the way that you even out the fortunes going forward of various biomes or various eco-states is through the Global Trust for Corporate Agroecological Integrity. There would be a transfer of resources necessary at that level, just as there already is at the international level through the existing international organizations. A lot of people don't know this, but the IMF, International Monetary Fund, has engaged in, especially in spurts of activity over the last 50 years, massive transfers of wealth from developed countries to economically less developed countries. Only in the overall scheme of things, in small amounts, but at least at the time, they were seen as very large transfers. So likewise, the new international economic order that was so touted in the 1970s also called for transfers of wealth. That would have to be done, it seems to me. There would have to be a great deal of that in order to take advantage of the ecological riches of some biomes and the lack thereof in other biomes. My main interest, though, of course, is in agroecological reform. And for that purpose, it seems to me that this sort of a grouping, especially for the temperate broadleaf and mixed forests, and for the temperate grasslands, savannas, and shrublands, and for the Mediterranean, number 12, is so essential that I'm willing to work with the problems that an overall global system might create and putting on top of it some international organization, very different from the ones that we have today, but some international organization that would level out the playing field. It may be an unsatisfactory answer to you. It's an unsatisfactory answer to me as well, but that's where I am so far.
Oh, it's on. Okay. Sorry, I have the mic. Thanks very much for this presentation. I really appreciate how comprehensive it is in thinking about how this would be deployed.
Oh, you've only seen a little part
Yeah,
of it.
no, I haven't. Now I will read your book and I will learn. I guess I know that you made the comment that it would be better to legislate rather than litigate. And I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit as a stepping stone between a full-blown change in governance, which I agree that we need on some level, and this is an interesting thought experiment to think about how that could be deployed. But I'm also thinking of Polly Higgins's ecocide, right? And sort of the idea of criminalizing and bringing that. And on a national level, I can speak from the U.S. perspective that we've, unfortunately had to, but it's been instructive to use the courts in cases of civil rights and in cases of environmental damage, and at a global scale, obviously, even though justice is late, sometimes genocide. And so I guess I'm just wondering if that can't be invoked, how do you address that in your book as a stepping stone to thinking about if you can charge for this crime, then ultimately at some level there has to be a governance structure to avoid committing that crime.
Sure.
And I guess I want to know what that connection is, because I do see a place for something like as simple as just getting ecocide on the books.
Sure, and I agree with that. I think that litigation is a powerful tool, and in fact it's been proven so far to be a powerful tool, at least in one little area within the United States. Our children's trust litigation has been quite effective in establishing some legal standing for future children, for children represented by what's that called? Well, represented by adults, and establishing that climate change and climate disruption can be a cause of action. Likewise, ecocide. I'm all for having as much litigation as possible. My concern with Mary Christina Wood's approach is that she seems to be focusing entirely on that. And I don't think ultimately you can squeeze enough juice out of that onion or blood out of that stone or whatever we squeeze from. I don't think you can get enough traction with just the litigation. And I think to spend a lot of time on the litigation, on the public trust doctrine and so forth, is maybe wasting time toward the legislation. And that, of course, takes building grassroots support for fundamental change, pressuring legislative bodies and ultimately people who are writing treaties to put it in the books to begin with. So that's my approach. It's both litigation and legislative approaches, but I think that it has to be, a lot of focus has to be done on establishing whole new regimes.
Thank you very much. Help me in thanking John.